The fluorescent lights in the ICU had been buzzing above my head for 3 days straight, and I'd memorized every crack in the ceiling tiles while sitting in that uncomfortable vinyl chair next to Theodore's hospital bed. My husband of 32 years lay motionless, connected to machines that beeped in a rhythm I'd come to hate, his chest rising and falling mechanically. The cardiologist who'd built a career saving other people's hearts couldn't save his own from whatever had attacked him in that hospital parking lot 4 days ago. I was checking my phone for the 100th time that morning, trying to focus on emails from my company that suddenly seemed meaningless when Dr. Marcus Kensington walked into the room. I'd seen him several times over the past few days, always professional and composed in his white coat, checking Theo's charts and adjusting medications with the quiet confidence of someone who'd trained for years to handle crises. But this time was different. His dark eyes kept darting toward me and then away, and his hands trembled slightly as he gripped a brown medical folder against his chest. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, his voice tight, "I need to speak with you. Privately. Right now." Something in his tone made my stomach drop. I'd been preparing myself for bad news about Theo's prognosis, expecting to hear that the brain damage was worse than they'd initially thought, that he might never wake up, that I should start considering difficult decisions. But the look on Dr. Kensington's face wasn't the practiced sympathy of a doctor delivering terrible but expected news. This was something else entirely. This was panic. I stood up, my Louboutin heels clicking against the linoleum floor as I followed him out of the ICU and down a hallway to a small consultation room that smelled like disinfectant and fear. He closed the door behind us and didn't sit down, just stood there gripping that folder like it might explode if he let go. "What's wrong?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, even though my heart was racing. "Is Theodore getting worse, Doctor?" Kensington ran his hand through his already disheveled black hair and looked at me with an expression I would later recognize as moral agony. "Mrs. Ashford, I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you violates every principle of doctor-patient confidentiality I've ever held sacred. I've been awake for 2 nights wrestling with this decision, consulting ethics boards in my head, trying to find any other way to handle this situation. But I can't. I can't keep this from you. You're scaring me," I said, and I meant it. My hands had started trembling, and I pressed them against my cream-colored Chanel skirt to steady them. "I discovered something in your husband's blood work," he said slowly, each word seeming to cost him something. "Something that doesn't make medical sense given what you've told us about your family history. We ran comprehensive panels because of the stroke, looking for underlying conditions, genetic markers, anything that might explain the cardiovascular event. And we found something that I cannot, in good conscience, keep from you, especially because it directly affects your son." The mention of Julian made my breath catch. "What does this have to do with Julian, Doctor?" Kensington opened the folder with shaking hands and pulled out several sheets of paper covered in medical terminology and numbers I didn't understand. "Mrs. Ashford, your husband had a vasectomy, a surgical sterilization procedure. According to the scar tissue and medical records we accessed through the national database, this procedure was performed in March 1995 at a clinic in Newark, New Jersey." I stared at him, my brain trying to process words that didn't make sense. "That's impossible. There must be some mistake. Theodore never had a vasectomy. We never even discussed him having a vasectomy." "There's no mistake," Dr. Kensington said quietly. "The surgical evidence is definitive. I had 3 different specialists confirm it because I couldn't believe it myself. Your husband had a bilateral vasectomy 30 years ago, Mrs. Ashford, 6 months before your son was born." The room tilted. I reached behind me for the wall, my fingers scrabbling against the smooth painted surface as my legs threatened to give out completely. Everything I knew about my life, every certainty I'd built my world upon for 3 decades, suddenly became smoke. "That can't be right," I whispered, but even as I said it, I knew it was. I could see the truth in Dr. Kensington's face, in the way he couldn't quite meet my eyes, in the tremor in his hands as he held those damning papers. Julian is 29 years old. He was born in December 1995. You're telling me that Theodore had a vasectomy in March of that year? Yes, ma'am. And you're certain? Absolutely certain? I've never been more certain of anything in my medical career, and I wish to God I wasn't. He set the papers on the small table between us. Mrs. Ashford, I'm violating HIPAA regulations by showing you this. I could lose my license. I've spent the last 72 hours trying to find a legal, ethical way to handle this situation, but every path I explore leads me back to the same conclusion. You need to know this. Your son needs to know this. Because the medical implications alone? Stop, I said, holding up my hand. My mind was racing, memories flooding back with new and terrible context. 1995. The year Julian was born, the year Theodore and I had gone through that horrible rough patch in our marriage, the year I'd made the worst mistake of my life. I'd been 27 years old, working myself to exhaustion, trying to build my consulting business, while Theodore spent every evening and weekend in his research lab. I felt invisible, lonely, abandoned in our tiny apartment, while my husband chased medical breakthroughs. And then there was a conference in Boston, too much wine, and a colleague named David, whose attention made me feel seen for the first time in months. One night. One terrible, regrettable night that I'd confessed to Theodore with tears streaming down my face 6 weeks later when I discovered I was pregnant. I'd expected him to leave me. I'd expected rage, divorce papers, the complete destruction of our marriage. Instead, Theodore had held my hands across our kitchen table and said, "We all make mistakes, Vivian. I haven't been the husband you needed. We'll get through this together. We'll raise this baby together. I forgive you." I'd been so grateful, so overwhelmed by his unexpected grace, that I'd never questioned his reaction. Never wondered why he seemed almost relieved by my confession. Never thought to ask why he didn't demand a paternity test or show any of the normal male insecurity about raising another man's child. Because he already knew. The timeline was suddenly, horrifically clear. Theodore had the vasectomy in March. Our marriage hit its lowest point in April and May. I had the affair in June. I told him about the pregnancy in August, and he'd known from the very first moment I said those words, "I'm pregnant," that the baby couldn't possibly be his. "Mrs. Ashford, are you all right?" Dr. Kensington's voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. "Do you need to sit down?" "I need to understand something," I said, my voice sounding strange and hollow in my own ears. "Why are you telling me this? If it violates your ethics and could cost you your license, why tell me at all?" He sat down heavily in one of the chairs, suddenly looking much older than his 44 years. "Because your son is getting married next spring, according to the information in his father's emergency contacts. Because the fiancé's family apparently has a history of genetic disorders, and I overheard the ICU nurse mention that Julian was asking about scheduling preconception genetic counseling. Because if your son goes into that counseling believing that Theodore's medical history is his biological medical history, he could make life-altering reproductive decisions based on completely false information." "Oh, God," I whispered. Julian and Sophia had been talking about starting a family immediately after the wedding. Sophia's mother had died of Huntington's disease, and they wanted comprehensive genetic screening before trying to conceive. They'd been planning to use Theodore's family medical history as part of that screening. "There's more," Dr. Kensington said, and I almost laughed at the absurdity of that statement. How could there possibly be more? "Your husband didn't have a spontaneous stroke, Mrs. Ashford. He had the cardiovascular event during an extremely heated argument in the hospital parking lot. There were witnesses who heard shouting. The paramedic who found him said he was conscious for the first few minutes, and he kept saying the same thing over and over. I had to tell them. I couldn't live with it anymore. I had to tell them the truth." The truth. 30 years of lies were suddenly recontextualizing themselves in my mind with dizzying speed. Every moment of our marriage that I'd thought was built on forgiveness and second chances was actually built on deception and secrets. Theodore had known for Julian's entire life that he wasn't his biological father, but he'd never said a word. He'd raised our son, paid for his education, walked him through Little League and high school graduation and Harvard acceptance, all while carrying this knowledge. But why? Why would he do that? Why would he forgive an affair, agree to raise another man's child, and then never mention his own vasectomy? What possible reason could justify 30 years of silence? Who was he arguing with, I asked. In the parking lot. Who was he arguing with when he collapsed? We don't know. The security cameras show a woman, approximately 50 to 55 years old, but the angle doesn't capture her face clearly. She left the scene before the ambulance arrived. We've been trying to identify her, but without a clear image. Show me the footage, I said. Show me right now. Dr. Kensington hesitated, then pulled out his phone and scrolled through several files before turning the screen toward me. The video was grainy and distant, shot from a parking lot security camera at an angle that showed mostly the tops of cars. But I could see two figures standing between a black Mercedes and a silver Audi. The taller figure was clearly Theodore, his posture recognizable even in the poor quality footage. The other figure was a woman in a long, dark coat. "Can you zoom in?" I asked. He pinched the screen, and the image became even grainier but slightly larger. The woman's face was mostly turned away from the camera, but for a brief moment as she gestured angrily, her profile became partially visible. And I saw the coat. The distinctive Burberry check pattern that I knew because I'd complimented it at Thanksgiving 3 years ago. "That's Linda," I said, my voice flat. "That's Theodore's sister." Dr. Kensington looked startled. "Are you certain?" "Absolutely certain. That's her coat, her posture, her height. Linda Ashford Bennett from Boston." I stared at the frozen image of my sister-in-law in what appeared to be a violent argument with my now comatose husband. She's never liked me. 32 years of barely concealed contempt for the immigrant assistant who trapped her brilliant baby brother. And apparently she knew. She knew about the vasectomy, about Julian, about all of it. And Theodore was arguing with her about telling us. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. Theodore had been distant and strange for months, maybe longer. The late nights at the hospital that seemed excessive even for his demanding schedule. The way he'd been looking at Julian lately with this odd mixture of sadness, and something I couldn't identify. The phone calls with Linda that he'd take in another room, lowering his voice when I walked by. He'd been planning to tell us. After 29 years of silence, Theodore had finally decided to reveal the truth, and Linda had tried to stop him. "Mrs. Ashford, I need you to understand the position this puts me in," Dr. Kensington said carefully. "I've given you this information because I believe you have a right to know and because your son needs this medical information for his own health decisions. But officially, I cannot acknowledge that we've had this conversation. The hospital's legal team would crucify me if they knew I'd disclosed patient information this way." "I understand," I said, though I barely heard him. My mind was already racing ahead, calculating what I needed to do next, who I needed to talk to, how I was going to handle this apocalyptic revelation. "Can I have copies of those documents?" He hesitated, then pulled several sheets from the folder and handed them to me. "These are copies I made on my personal printer. They don't exist in any official record. If anyone asks, I never gave them to you." I took the papers with hands that had stopped shaking and started feeling cold and numb instead. The top sheet showed Theodore's medical records from the New Jersey clinic. Bilateral vasectomy, performed on March 14, 1995. Patient paid in cash. No insurance claims filed. It was right there in black and white. The evidence of a secret my husband had kept for 30 years. A secret that meant my entire adult life had been built on a foundation of lies. "Thank you," I said to Dr. Kensington, though I wasn't sure what I was thanking him for. For destroying my world? For giving me information I could never unknow? For being brave or foolish enough to violate his professional ethics because he thought it was the right thing to do? "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Ashford. I wish I'd never found this. I wish I could give you different news." I walked out of that consultation room and back toward the ICU, my heels clicking on the linoleum with each step, carrying papers that would change everything. Through the window, I could see Theodore still lying in that bed, machines breathing for him, keeping him alive while his secrets finally came crashing down around us. And I realized that the man I'd been married to for 32 years, the man I'd built a life with, raised a son with, was a complete stranger. I didn't know him at all. I never had. I didn't go back into Theodore's room right away. Instead, I found myself walking through the hospital corridors with no real destination, those papers clutched in my hand, my mind dragging me backward through 3 decades of memories that now looked completely different in the harsh light of this new truth. I met Theodore Ashford in September 1993, when I was 25 years old and he was 35. I was working as an administrative assistant at Manhattan Medical Center, answering phones and scheduling appointments in the cardiology department while taking night classes for my MBA at a community college in Queens. My parents had died in a car accident 3 years earlier, and I was completely alone in the world, an immigrant daughter with no family, no safety net, just a fierce determination to build something meaningful from nothing. Theodore was already a rising star in the department, young, brilliant, from a prestigious Boston family of doctors going back 4 generations. The Ashfords had money, connections, legacy admissions to Yale and Harvard Medical School. Everything came easily to Theodore because everything had always come easily to him. He was handsome in that preppy, old money way, tall with thick hair and those blue eyes that seemed to look right through you. Women on staff used to manufacture reasons to walk past his office. But he noticed me. I still don't fully understand why, but he did. Maybe I represented something authentic in his world of carefully maintained appearances. Maybe he was rebelling against his mother's expectations that he'd marry someone from the social register. Or maybe he just liked the way I looked in the skirts I'd bought from consignment shops and altered myself to fit properly. We started dating in October. By March 1994, we were engaged. His family was horrified. His mother, Patricia Ashford, made it abundantly clear that I was not what she'd envisioned for her son. At our engagement dinner at some exclusive club in Boston, she'd asked me pointed questions about my background and whether I understood the responsibilities that came with the Ashford name. His sister Linda had been even worse, barely speaking to me, her contempt written across her face every time she looked at me. But Theodore seemed to love that I made his family uncomfortable. He proposed to me in front of them, right there in that club, getting down on one knee with his grandmother's ring while his mother's face went pale. I thought it was romantic. I thought he was choosing me over their prejudices. Looking back now, I wondered if I was just another form of rebellion for him, another way to assert independence from a family that had controlled every aspect of his life. We married in June 1994. Small ceremony, mostly my friends from work and his colleagues from the hospital. His family attended, but made their disapproval clear through tight smiles and minimal conversation. Linda didn't come to the reception, said she had a prior commitment that couldn't be moved. The first year of marriage was good. We were happy, or at least I thought we were. I was still working at the hospital and taking classes. Theodore was establishing his cardiology practice and conducting research on the side. We had a tiny apartment in Manhattan that cost more than I'd thought possible to pay for 800 square feet. But Theodore said it was temporary, just until we could afford something better. Then 1995 happened. And everything fell apart in ways I didn't fully understand until right now, standing in this hospital corridor holding evidence of my husband's 30-year deception. In early 1995, Theodore became obsessed with his research. He'd always been dedicated, but this was different. He was at the lab every night until 10 or 11, sometimes not coming home until after midnight. Weekends disappeared. When he was home, he was distant, distracted, barely present. I'd try to talk to him about it, about us, about the fact that we were newlyweds and I was eating dinner alone 5 nights a week, and he'd just say he was close to a breakthrough. This research was important. I needed to understand how competitive the medical field was. I was lonely. I was 27 years old, married to a man I barely saw, working a dead-end administrative job while watching my MBA classmates launch careers and build lives. I felt invisible. I felt like I'd married Theodore's potential, rather than Theodore himself. The conference in Boston happened in early June. My company sent me to handle registration for a medical device expo, 3 days of setting up booths and managing schedules. David was one of the sales representatives, charming and attentive in a way Theodore hadn't been in months. We had drinks after the first day. Too many drinks. And I made a choice that I knew was wrong even as I was making it. A choice born from loneliness and wine and the desperate need to feel like someone actually saw me. I told Theodore 6 weeks later, when the pregnancy test came back positive. I couldn't live with the lie. I sat him down in our kitchen on a Saturday morning and confessed everything through tears, expecting him to leave me, expecting rage and divorce and the complete destruction of what little I'd built for myself. His reaction shocked me. He went quiet for a long time, staring at his coffee cup, his face unreadable. Then he reached across the table and took my hands. "We all make mistakes, Vivienne," he said. "I haven't been the husband you needed. I've been selfish with my time and my attention. This is partly my fault. We'll get through this together. We'll raise this baby together. I forgive you." I'd been so grateful, so overwhelmed by his unexpected grace. I cried harder, told him I didn't deserve his forgiveness, promised I'd spend the rest of my life being the wife he deserved. He just held me and said we'd start fresh, that the baby would be a new beginning for us. Julian was born in December 1995. 8 pounds, 6 ounces, with a shock of dark hair and blue eyes that eventually turned the same shade as Theodore's. Theodore was there for the birth, held our son in the delivery room, cried tears I believed were genuine. And for 29 years, he raised Julian as his own without ever, not once, mentioning the affair or questioning paternity or throwing my mistake back in my face during arguments. I thought it was because he was a good man, a forgiving man, a man who understood that people make mistakes and that love means moving forward rather than dwelling in the past. But he'd had the vasectomy in March. 3 months before my affair, 3 months before there was anything to forgive. Which meant when I confessed to him about David, when I told him I was pregnant and braced myself for his anger, Theodore already knew with absolute certainty that the baby wasn't his. He knew because he'd made it biologically impossible for him to father children. And instead of telling me that, instead of revealing his own secret, he'd accepted my confession and pretended to forgive an affair that had actually given him exactly what he wanted. A child without whatever genetic risk had driven him to get sterilized in the first place. I found a bench near a window overlooking the parking lot and sat down, my legs finally giving out. The parking lot where Theodore had collapsed, where he'd been arguing with Linda about finally telling the truth after 3 decades of lies. My phone buzzed. A text from Julian. "Mom, still at the office but heading to hospital around 6. Do you need anything? How's Dad?" How was I supposed to answer that? "Your father is in a coma. And by the way, he's not actually your biological father, and he's known this your entire life but never mentioned it." I looked at the medical documents in my hand. Hard evidence of Theodore's vasectomy, proof that every assumption I'd built my life on was false, and suddenly I was angry. Not the hot, explosive anger that burns out quickly, but the cold, deep anger that settles into your bones and changes something fundamental about who you are. Theodore had let me carry guilt for 29 years. Every time I looked at Julian and saw echoes of David in the shape of his smile or the way he laughed, I'd felt that guilt. Every anniversary, every family photo, Every moment of our life together had been shadowed by my belief that I'd betrayed my husband and he'd been saint enough to forgive me. But it was all a lie. Theodore hadn't forgiven me out of love or grace. He'd used my confession as cover for his own deception. He'd let me believe I was the one who'd damaged our marriage, the one who'd brought complexity and difficulty into our perfect life, when all along he'd been keeping a secret that made my one-night mistake look insignificant by comparison. I thought about all the times over the years when I'd started to assert myself in our marriage, to push back against Theodore's control, or demand more attention or question his decisions. And I'd stopped myself because I felt I owed him, because he'd forgiven me, because I was lucky he'd stayed. I thought about how my business had grown from nothing to a multi-million-dollar consulting firm, and how Theodore had never quite seemed proud of my success. How he'd make small comments about me working too much, spending too much time away from family, prioritizing money over relationships. How he'd frame it as concern, but it always felt like criticism. And I'd absorbed it, scaled back, turned down opportunities, because I felt guilty about the affair, about forcing him to raise another man's child. Except he'd wanted to raise that child. He'd chosen it. He'd engineered a situation where he could be a father without whatever biological risk terrified him enough to get secretly sterilized at 32 years old. I pulled out my phone and called Rebecca. She answered on the second ring. "Viv? What's wrong? Is Theodore—" "I need you to come to Manhattan Medical Center right now," I said, my voice steady and cold. "And I need you to bring your legal connections, all of them. I need to access medical records that are going to be very difficult to access legally." "What's going on?" "Theodore had a vasectomy 30 years ago, 6 months before Julian was born. And I just found out from his neurologist, who violated about 17 different regulations, to tell me because Julian is about to make reproductive decisions based on completely false genetic information." Silence on the other end. Then, "I'm on my way. Don't talk to anyone else until I get there." She hung up, and I sat there on that bench, looking out at the parking lot where my husband had collapsed while arguing with his sister about whether to finally tell the truth. And I realized that the man in that ICU bed, the man I'd been married to for 32 years, was a stranger. I didn't know why he'd had the vasectomy. I didn't know what genetic risk he'd been so terrified of. I didn't know if he'd ever actually loved me or if I'd just been convenient, a woman who'd handed him the perfect cover story by confessing to an affair at exactly the right moment. I didn't know anything at all. And now he was unconscious, unable to answer any of the 1,000 questions burning through my mind. But I was going to find the answers anyway, because I deserved the truth. And so did Julian. Rebecca arrived 40 minutes later, striding through the hospital lobby in her power suit and heels, carrying the leather briefcase that meant she was in full lawyer mode. She'd been my best friend since we met at those MBA night classes back in 1993, and she'd built a career as a family law attorney with a reputation for being ruthless when her clients needed her to be. Right now, I needed her to be exactly that ruthless. She found me still sitting on that bench, and without a word, she sat down beside me and took my hand. "Show me everything," she said. I handed her the medical documents Dr. Kensington had given me. She read through them slowly, her face getting harder with each page. When she finished, she looked at me with something that might have been pity if Rebecca ever allowed herself that emotion. "This is bad, Viv. This is really bad." "I know." "No, I don't think you do. This isn't just about Theodore lying to you for 30 years. This has legal implications, medical implications. If Julian goes into genetic counseling believing Theodore's medical history is relevant to his biological profile, that's medical fraud. If Theodore has a will that treats Julian as his biological son without disclosure of this information, that could be contested by his family. If there are life insurance policies, inheritance trusts, anything that assumes biological paternity. "Linda knows," I interrupted. "She was there in the parking lot when Theodore collapsed. They were arguing about him telling us the truth. The hospital has security footage." Rebecca's eyes sharpened. Have you seen this footage? Dr. Kensington showed me on his phone. It's not clear enough for facial recognition, but I know Linda's coat, her height, her posture. It was her. Then we need that footage officially, and we need to find out exactly what Linda knows and how long she's known it. Rebecca pulled out her phone and started typing rapidly. I'm calling in some favors. I have a contact at the hospital's legal department who owes me, and another contact who can access medical databases that normal people can't access. If Theodore had a vasectomy at a clinic in New Jersey in 1995, there will be records beyond what Dr. Kensington found. Consent forms, payment records, maybe even notes about why he wanted the procedure. He was 32 years old, I said. No children. Most doctors won't even perform vasectomies on men that young without a medical reason. Exactly, which means there was a reason, and we're going to find out what it was. She stood up, all business now. Where's Julian right now? At his office. He's planning to come by around 6. Good, that gives us a few hours. Do not tell him anything yet, not until we know the full scope of what we're dealing with. If we tell him now with incomplete information, it could make everything worse. She was right, but the thought of looking at my son and not telling him the truth made me feel sick. Rebecca, he deserves to know. He's planning genetic counseling with Sophia's doctors. They're talking about starting a family right after the wedding. And he will know. But we need to control how and when he finds out, and we need to have all the facts first. Trust me on this, Viv. I've seen families destroy themselves by revealing devastating information at the wrong time, in the wrong way. I nodded, even though everything in me wanted to call Julian immediately, to warn him, to somehow cushion the blow that was coming. But Rebecca was the expert here. I had to trust her judgment. She made 3 phone calls right there in the hallway, speaking in the clipped professional tone she used when she was pulling strings and calling in favors. By the time she hung up from the 3rd call, she had a meeting scheduled with the hospital's legal team in 30 minutes and a promise from her investigator contact to dig into Theodore's medical history, going back to his childhood. Come on, she said. We're going to get that security footage officially, and then we're going to have a very difficult conversation with your sister-in-law. The meeting with the hospital's legal team was tense. They didn't want to release the security footage, citing privacy concerns and ongoing investigation into Theodore's collapse. But Rebecca was relentless. She argued that as Theodore's wife and medical proxy, I had a right to any information related to his medical emergency, including evidence of who he was with when the event occurred. She threatened subpoenas and legal action and made it very clear that the hospital's liability increased exponentially every hour they withheld information from a patient's spouse. They finally agreed to let us view the footage in an official capacity, but they wouldn't give us a copy. Rebecca and I sat in a sterile conference room while a hospital security officer played the parking lot video on a laptop screen. Watching it on a larger screen made everything worse. I could see the argument escalating, could see Theodore's agitation increasing, could see the moment Linda shoved him and he staggered backward with his hand going to his chest. Could see him collapse to the pavement while Linda stood there frozen for almost a full minute before running to her car and driving away. She left him there, I said, my voice hollow. She pushed him and he collapsed and she just left him. Did she call 911? Rebecca asked the security officer. He checked his notes. Someone called from a blocked number approximately 3 minutes after the subject collapsed. The caller reported a man down in the parking lot, but disconnected before providing any identifying information. That was probably her, Rebecca said. Called anonymously so she wouldn't have to explain what happened or why she was there. The security officer played the video again, and this time I focused on the body language before the shove. Theodore was gesturing emphatically, pointing at Linda, his whole body leaning forward in obvious agitation. Linda had her arms crossed defensively at first, then she started gesturing back, her movements getting sharper and more aggressive. Whatever they were arguing about, it was heated enough that both of them had lost control. I need to talk to her, I said. I need to know what Theodore told her and why she was trying to stop him from telling us. Rebecca looked at the security officer. Can we get a timestamp on when this incident occurred? 3:47 p.m., 4 days ago. I pulled out my phone and checked my call history. Linda had called me that evening at 8:15, 3 hours after her brother collapsed in front of her. I'd let it go to voicemail because I'd been dealing with the emergency room chaos, and I hadn't listened to the message yet. With shaking hands, I pulled up the voicemail and put it on speaker. Linda's voice came through, tight and controlled. Vivian, it's Linda. I heard about Theodore's collapse. I'm sorry I can't come down to New York right now. I have commitments here in Boston that I can't break. Please keep me updated on his condition. And Vivian, when he wakes up, tell him I'm sorry. Tell him I understand now why he felt he had to do this. Tell him I was wrong. Rebecca and I looked at each other. She knew he was planning to tell you, Rebecca said. She was trying to stop him, probably arguing that the truth would cause more harm than good, and when he collapsed, she panicked. But then she called you and basically admitted she knew something. She said, when he wakes up, not if, I noted. She expected him to recover. She expected him to tell us himself. Which means she doesn't know the extent of the brain damage, Rebecca said. She doesn't know he might never wake up, or that even if he does, he might not be capable of explaining himself. We have the advantage here. We left the hospital and drove to Boston in Rebecca's car, making the 4-hour trip in tense silence, broken only by occasional updates from her investigator. By the time we pulled up to Linda's brownstone in Beacon Hill, we had preliminary information that made Theodore's secret even more disturbing. Theodore had an older half-brother named Michael who died in 1987 before I ever met Theodore. Michael had been born when Patricia Ashford was married to her first husband, and he'd suffered from a severe genetic disorder that had left him institutionalized for most of his short life. The disorder was hereditary, passed through the paternal line. Michael's father had it in a milder form. Michael had it severely and died at 19. When Patricia married Theodore's father, there was apparently extensive genetic counseling before they decided to have children. Theodore's father tested negative for the genetic markers. Theodore should have been fine, but according to the investigators' preliminary findings, Theodore had somehow gotten tested in his late 20s and discovered he was a carrier for a related genetic disorder, probably inherited through some other family line. Not the same one that killed Michael, but close enough to terrify him. That's why he got the vasectomy, Rebecca said as we sat in her car outside Linda's house. He was afraid of passing on something catastrophic to his children. But Julian is fine, I said. He's 29 years old and perfectly healthy. Because Theodore isn't his biological father, but Theodore didn't know that when you got pregnant. He must have been terrified when you told him. I thought about that moment in our kitchen, when I'd confessed my affair through tears. Theodore's long silence, his unreadable expression. What had been going through his mind? Relief that the baby wasn't biologically his? Fear that I'd somehow gotten pregnant despite his vasectomy? Calculation about how to use my confession to cover his own secret? Linda's house was a 3-story brownstone worth at least $3 million, all old Boston money and careful preservation of historical details. Rebecca and I walked up the front steps and rang the doorbell. It took several rings before Linda finally answered, and when she saw me standing there, her face went pale. Vivian, what are you doing here? We need to talk about your brother, I said. About what he told you. About what you were arguing about in that parking lot when he collapsed. She tried to close the door. Rebecca put her foot in the way. Mrs. Bennett, I'm Rebecca Thornton, Mrs. Ashford's attorney. You can talk to us here, or we can discuss this in front of the police, who will be very interested to know why you fled the scene of a medical emergency after physically assaulting the victim. Linda's face crumpled. She was 59 years old, impeccably dressed even at home in cashmere and pearls, her gray blonde hair styled in the same classic bob she'd worn for decades. She'd always seemed so controlled, so superior, so utterly confident in her position in the world. But right now, She just looked old and scared. "Come in," she said quietly. We followed her into a living room that looked like a museum, all antique furniture and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors. She didn't offer us tea or coffee or any of the social niceties she'd normally have insisted upon. She just sat down on a velvet settee and folded her hands in her lap like she was bracing for execution. "How much do you know?" she asked. "I know about the vasectomy," I said. "I know Theodore had it done 6 months before Julian was born. I know you were in that parking lot arguing with him about telling us the truth. What I don't know is why. Why did he do it? Why did he keep it secret? And why were you trying to stop him from finally being honest?" Linda was quiet for a long moment, her hands twisting together. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Did Theodore ever tell you about our half-brother Michael?" "No? I found out about him today through background research." She nodded, unsurprised. Theodore was only 10 when Michael died, but it destroyed him. Michael spent most of his life in an institution, unable to walk or talk or recognize his own family. Our mother visited him every week for 19 years, and Theodore went with her sometimes. He saw what that genetic disorder did, how it ravaged not just Michael, but our entire family. "So he got tested," I said, "when he was 28. He was in a serious relationship, talking about marriage, and he decided he needed to know if he carried any genetic risks before having children. The tests came back showing he was a carrier for a different disorder, not the same one that killed Michael, but related, potentially severe. His doctors told him there was a 30% chance any biological child of his would be affected. So he got a vasectomy." "He got a vasectomy," Linda confirmed, "and he didn't tell anyone except me. Not our parents, not his girlfriend at the time, no one. He broke up with her a month later without explaining why. Then he threw himself into his work and didn't date anyone seriously for years until he met you." I felt something crack inside my chest. "He married me, knowing he couldn't give me children. I told him on our second date that I wanted a family. I was very clear about it, and he married me anyway, without telling me he'd made it impossible." "He loved you," Linda said, and for the first time since I'd known her, she sounded genuine. "I saw the way he looked at you. It wasn't the calculated partnership he'd had with previous girlfriends from appropriate families. You made him happy in a way I hadn't seen since before Michael died. But yes, he should have told you about the vasectomy before the wedding. That was wrong." "Then I got pregnant," I said. "And I confessed to having an affair." "What did he tell you when that happened?" Linda's face twisted with something that might have been guilt. "He called me that night, completely panicked. He said you'd confessed to sleeping with someone else and that you were pregnant. He knew immediately that the baby couldn't be his, obviously. But instead of being angry about the affair, he was relieved, almost euphoric. He said it was like God had given him a way to be a father without the genetic risk. He could raise your baby as his own and never have to explain about the vasectomy or the genetic testing or any of it. So he used my mistake as cover for his lie," I said flatly. "He convinced himself he was being noble," Linda said. "Forgiving your affair, agreeing to raise another man's child. He turned his deception into an act of generosity in his own mind. And I let him. I should have told you the truth back then. I should have told you that you weren't actually in his debt, that he was using your guilt to hide his own secrets. But I didn't." "Why?" Rebecca asked sharply. "Why would you protect his lie?" "Because I thought it was kinder," Linda said, and now there were tears in her eyes. "I thought the affair was a one-time mistake, that you and Theodore would build a happy life together, that Julian would grow up loved and secure. I thought the truth would only cause unnecessary pain. And for almost 30 years, that seemed to be correct. You built a good life. Theodore was a devoted father. Julian thrived. What would have been the point of destroying all that with revelations about the past?" "The point," I said, my voice shaking with rage, is that I had a right to make informed decisions about my own life. I had a right to know that my husband had lied to me from the beginning. I had a right to not spend 3 decades feeling grateful for forgiveness I never actually needed. You and Theodore stole that from me. You stole my agency and my truth, and my right to decide for myself what I could live with. Linda flinched like I'd slapped her. You're right. I know you're right. And Theodore knew it too, finally. That's what we were arguing about in the parking lot. He called me 3 months ago and said he couldn't live with the lie anymore. Julian was getting married, planning to have children, and Theodore was terrified that hiding the genetic information could put his grandchildren at risk. Not from his genes, obviously, but from not knowing their actual genetic heritage. He said Julian deserved to know the truth before becoming a father himself. And you tried to stop him. Yes, I told him it would destroy everything. That Julian would hate him, that you would leave him, that he was being selfish by relieving his own conscience at the expense of everyone else's peace. We argued for months. He finally told me he'd made an appointment with a family therapist, that he was going to tell you and Julian in a controlled setting with professional support. The appointment was scheduled for next week. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her mascara. That day in the parking lot was supposed to be our last conversation before he told you. I went there to make one final attempt to change his mind. I told him he was making a terrible mistake, that some truths are better left buried. He told me I was wrong, that lies always cause more damage than truth, no matter how painful. I got angry. I pushed him, and then he grabbed his chest and fell, and I realized what I'd done. You left him there, I said. Your brother was dying in front of you, and you ran away. I called 911, she said desperately. I called from my cell phone and told them where he was. I just couldn't stay. I couldn't face what I'd done. I drove home, and I've been sitting in this house for 4 days, knowing that I might have killed my own brother to protect a lie that wasn't even mine to protect. Rebecca and I looked at each other. Linda's confession gave us everything we needed, but it didn't make me feel any better. It just made the whole situation more tragic and pointless. Theodore had finally decided to do the right thing, and his own sister had literally fought him to keep the secret buried. What happens now? Linda asked quietly. Now I tell Julian the truth, I said. The truth that his father should have told him 29 years ago, and you're going to help me do it. You're going to come to New York, and you're going to confirm everything Theodore told you, so Julian knows I'm not making this up or trying to destroy his father's memory. You owe us that much. Linda nodded, looking defeated. I'll come tomorrow. I'll tell him everything Theodore told me. But Vivian, I am sorry. For all of it. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am truly sorry. I stood up to leave. At the doorway, I turned back. Did Theodore ever actually love me, or was I just convenient? Linda met my eyes, and for once, her expression was completely sincere. He loved you. I honestly believe he did. But he loved you the way broken people love, with conditions and secrets and the need to control the narrative. He loved you as much as he was capable of loving anyone. I just don't think he was capable of very much. Rebecca and I drove back to New York in silence. It was almost midnight when we got back to the city, too late to go to the hospital, too late to do anything but go home and try to process what we'd learned. But I couldn't go home to the empty house in Greenwich, couldn't face the bedroom I'd shared with Theodore for 32 years, now knowing that every moment of our marriage had been contaminated by his lies. Instead, I checked into a hotel in Manhattan. Rebecca stayed with me, and we ordered room service that neither of us ate and sat up talking until 3 a.m. about how I was going to tell Julian that his entire identity was built on deception. That his father wasn't his father. That his mother's greatest shame was actually a gift that had given Theodore exactly what he wanted. That the family he'd believed in his whole life was a carefully constructed fiction. He's going to be devastated, I said. This is going to destroy him. Yes, Rebecca agreed, but he'll survive it. And eventually, He'll be grateful that you told him the truth instead of perpetuating the lie. Truth is always better than deception, Viv. Always. I wanted to believe her, but as I lay in that hotel bed staring at the ceiling, all I could think about was my son's face when I told him his whole life had been a lie. And I wondered if there was any way to deliver that kind of devastating truth without destroying the person you were trying to protect. I went back to the hospital the next morning, exhausted and hollow, to find Julian already there. He was sitting in the chair I'd occupied for days, holding his father's hand and talking quietly to him about a case he was working on. Something about corporate merger regulations that would have bored me, even if my world wasn't currently disintegrating. He looked up when I walked in, and the concern on his face almost broke me. "Mom, where were you? I came by last night around 6, like I said, and the nurses told me you'd left hours earlier. I've been calling you." I'd turned my phone off at the hotel, couldn't face talking to anyone, couldn't pretend everything was normal when nothing would ever be normal again. "I'm sorry. I needed to take care of some things. Julian, we need to talk, not here." He stood up, immediately alert to the tension in my voice. "Is Dad getting worse? Did the doctors say something?" "Not here," I repeated. "There's a private consultation room down the hall. Come with me." I saw him glance back at Theodore one more time before following me out. In that moment, he still believed his father was a good man who'd raised him with love and dedication. In a few minutes, I was going to take that belief away from him forever. The consultation room was empty. I closed the door and gestured for Julian to sit down, but he remained standing, his lawyer instincts clearly telling him this was bad news that required preparation. He looked so much like Theodore in that moment, tall and serious with those blue eyes that had come from my husband's genes, except they hadn't. They'd come from David, whose last name I could barely remember now. "Mom, you're scaring me. What's going on?" I pulled the medical documents from my purse and handed them to him. "Your father had a vasectomy in March 1995, 6 months before you were born. The hospital discovered it when they ran comprehensive blood work after his collapse. Dr. Kensington felt ethically obligated to tell me because you're planning genetic counseling with Sophia." Julian stared at the papers in his hand like they were written in a foreign language. "This doesn't make sense. There must be some mistake. Dad didn't have a vasectomy." "There's no mistake. I've verified it through multiple sources. The surgical evidence is definitive." I took a breath, steadying myself for what came next. "Julian, when I was 27 years old, your father and I went through a difficult period in our marriage. He was distant, obsessed with his work, barely home. And I made a terrible mistake. I had an affair with a colleague. One night. I confessed to your father 6 weeks later when I found out I was pregnant. I watched my son's face as he processed this information. Watched confusion turn to understanding, turn to horror as he realized what I was telling him. Dad forgave me, I continued, my voice remarkably steady considering my heart was shattering. He said we'd raise the baby together, that we'd move past my mistake. And for 29 years, I believed he'd shown me extraordinary grace by choosing to be your father despite my betrayal. I paused. But he already knew you couldn't be biologically his. The vasectomy made that impossible. He didn't forgive me out of generosity, Julian. He used my affair as cover for his own deception. Julian sat down then, or more accurately, his legs gave out and he collapsed into the chair. The papers slipped from his hands and scattered across the floor. You're telling me Dad isn't my biological father? Yes. And he knew this my entire life? Yes. And he never said anything. For 29 years, he never said anything. He was planning to tell us next week. He'd made an appointment with a family therapist. That's what he was arguing with Linda about when he collapsed. She was trying to convince him to keep the secret buried. He told her he couldn't live with the lie anymore, that you deserved to know the truth before you started your own family. Julian looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, something raw and broken that made him look much younger than 29. Who was he? The man you had the affair with? His name was David. He was a sales representative I met at a conference. It was one night, Julian. One stupid, regrettable night when I was lonely and made a terrible choice. I swallowed hard. He died 5 years ago in a car accident. You'll never have the chance to meet him or ask him questions or know anything about him beyond what I can tell you, which isn't much because I barely knew him myself. So half of my genetic heritage is from a stranger you slept with once and can barely remember. His voice was flat, emotionless, which was somehow worse than if he'd been yelling. And the other half is from you. And Dad, the man who raised me, who I thought was my father, isn't actually related to me at all. Biologically, no, but Julian, he loved you. Whatever else was true, whatever lies he told, he loved you. I saw it every day for 29 years. The way he looked at you, the pride when you got into Harvard, the— Stop. Julian held up his hand. Just stop, Mom. Don't tell me he loved me. Don't try to make this better by talking about his feelings. He lied to me for my entire life. He let me believe he was my father while knowing it was false. He watched me build my entire identity around being an Ashford, carrying on the family legacy of doctors and excellence and all of it. And he knew it was based on a lie. He stood up and started pacing, running his hands through his hair in a gesture so reminiscent of Theodore that it hurt to watch. Sophia and I were planning to do genetic counseling. We were going to use Dad's medical history to make decisions about our children. We could have made critical mistakes because of information we thought was true, but wasn't. I know. That's part of why the doctor told me. He said you needed the truth for medical reasons, even though revealing it violated patient confidentiality. Julian stopped pacing and looked at me with something that might have been accusation. You had an affair. You got pregnant with another man's baby. How could you not know Dad couldn't be the father? The question hit me like a physical blow. Because I didn't know about the vasectomy, Julian. I thought the baby was his. The timing was close enough that it could have been either man's child, and I assumed it was your father's because that's what made sense. When I confessed the affair, I was bracing myself for him to demand a paternity test or leave me. Instead, he forgave me immediately and never questioned whether you were his. Why would I have doubted it? Because you slept with someone else, Julian said harshly. Because you betrayed Dad, and then apparently never bothered to verify whose child you were actually carrying. I made a mistake, I said, feeling my own anger rising now. One mistake in a moment of weakness and loneliness. Your father made a choice. He deliberately had a vasectomy without telling me, deliberately used my confession as cover for his lie, and deliberately let both of us believe a false reality for 3 decades. Don't you dare make me the villain in this story, Julian. I'm not the one who built our family on deception. He stared at me for a long moment, and I saw him struggling with competing emotions, trying to find someone to blame for the destruction of everything he'd believed about himself. Finally, he said, I need to go. I can't be here right now. I can't look at you or Dad or any of this. Julian. No, Mom. I need time. I need to process this without you trying to explain it or justify it or make it make sense. My entire identity just imploded. The man I thought was my father isn't. The mother I trusted kept secrets about my origins. Half my DNA comes from a stranger I'll never know. Everything I thought I knew about who I am is wrong. So I need you to give me space to figure out what's left. He walked out of the consultation room without looking back. I heard his footsteps echoing down the hallway, growing fainter, until there was just silence and the distant beeping of hospital machines and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I sat there alone for a long time, holding medical documents that had destroyed my family, thinking about how Theodore had been right about one thing. The truth was coming out whether we were ready for it or not, and it was destroying everything in its path, just like Linda had warned him it would. But at least it was the truth. At least we weren't living in a comfortable lie anymore. At least Julian would make informed decisions about his own future rather than operating on false assumptions. I just hoped that would be enough. That someday, when the initial devastation faded, My son would understand that I'd told him because he deserved to know, not because I wanted to hurt him. But right now, looking at the empty doorway where he'd disappeared, I wasn't sure he'd ever forgive me, or if I'd ever forgive Theodore for putting us in this position in the first place. Julian didn't come back to the hospital that day, or the next. He stopped answering my calls and responding to my texts. When I drove to his apartment in Manhattan, he wouldn't open the door. I stood in that hallway for 20 minutes, talking through the door like a desperate woman, begging him to let me explain, to let me help him through this, until a neighbor came out and asked if there was a problem. Rebecca tried calling him too. He sent her a single text. "I need time, please respect that." So I gave him time, because what choice did I have? I went back to sitting in Theodore's hospital room, watching my husband breathe through machines, his face peaceful in unconsciousness, while the lives of everyone who loved him fell apart around him. On the third day after I told Julian the truth, Sophia showed up at the hospital. She looked immaculate as always, her black hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail, wearing one of those effortlessly expensive outfits that only genuinely wealthy people can pull off. But her eyes were red, and I could see she'd been crying. "Mrs. Ashford," she said formally, "may I speak with you?" We went to the cafeteria and got coffee neither of us wanted. She sat across from me, her hands wrapped around the cup, and said, "Julian told me everything, about the vasectomy, about the affair, about his biological father. I'm so sorry you had to learn about this, Sophia. I know this affects your plans with Julian." "He's devastated," she said quietly. "I've never seen him like this. He won't eat, barely sleeps, just sits in his apartment going through old photo albums like he's searching for clues he missed. He keeps saying he doesn't know who he is anymore." Guilt crashed over me in waves. I know this is terrible timing with the wedding coming up. If you need to postpone— "We're not postponing," Sophia interrupted. "We're canceling. I ended the engagement yesterday." I stared at her, shocked. Because of this? Because Julian isn't Theodore's biological son? "Sophia, this doesn't change who he is. He's still the same man you fell in love with." "No, he's not," she said simply. "The man I fell in love with was confident, focused, knew exactly who he was and where he came from. This Julian is broken and angry and lost. And instead of turning to me for support, instead of letting me help him through this, he shut me out completely. He told me he can't think about the wedding or the future or anything beyond trying to figure out who his real father was and why his entire life has been a lie." She set down her coffee cup with careful precision. "My family has been through enough genetic uncertainty with my mother's Huntington's. I can't build a marriage with someone who's having an identity crisis and doesn't even want me there while he works through it. I deserve a partner who can actually be present in the relationship, and right now, Julian can't be that person. Maybe he never will be again." "He just needs time," I said, hearing the desperation in my own voice. "This is a massive shock, but he'll work through it. He's resilient, Sophia. You know he is." "I know he was," she corrected gently. "I don't know who he is now. And honestly, Mrs. Ashford, I'm not sure you do either. None of us do. That's the problem." She stood up, slinging her designer bag over her shoulder. "I'm sorry about your husband. I hope he recovers. But I can't wait around to see if Julian recovers from this too. I'm 27 years old. I want to get married and have children and build a life with someone. Julian can't even think about next week without having a panic attack about whether his genetics are safe to pass on. So I'm moving on. I suggest you prepare for the possibility that Julian might never forgive you for this." I watched her walk away, another casualty of Theodore's decades-old decision to keep his secrets. Sophia had been good for Julian, grounding and practical and genuinely loving. And now she was gone, because my son couldn't handle the truth about his origins. That evening, Linda arrived from Boston as she'd promised. She looked terrible, like she'd aged 10 years in the past week. We sat in Theodore's hospital room together, and she told me more about what Theodore had confided in her over the years. How he'd been tormented by the lie, especially as Julian got older and started looking more and more like David in certain expressions and mannerisms. How he'd wanted to tell us 100 times, but always convinced himself it would cause more harm than good. How the decision to finally reveal the truth had taken him months of therapy and agonizing before he'd worked up the courage. He was terrified, Linda said, looking at her unconscious brother. Terrified you'd leave him, terrified Julian would hate him, but more terrified of dying with the secret still buried. He said he couldn't die a coward, that he needed to face the consequences of his choices while he was still alive to explain himself and apologize properly. Well, he got his wish, I said bitterly. The truth came out, and it destroyed everything, just like you warned him it would. Are you satisfied? Linda flinched. I was wrong. I spent the last week thinking about what I said to him, about how I pushed him to keep lying. I was so certain that maintaining the illusion was kinder than revealing the truth. But all I did was enable him to keep hurting you and Julian. The truth was always going to come out eventually. Better it came from Theodore with explanations and context than from a medical crisis like this. Except it did come from a medical crisis, I reminded her, because you pushed him and caused the stroke that put him in this coma. I know. Believe me, I know. I'll carry that guilt for the rest of my life. She looked at me with genuine remorse. Have you told Julian about my part in this? About the argument in the parking lot? Not yet. He won't speak to me. He's shut everyone out while he processes his existential crisis. Linda stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the New York skyline. When we were children, Theodore was the golden boy. Everything came easily to him. Good grades, athletic talent, social popularity, our parents' approval. I was the difficult one, always fighting for attention and recognition. I resented him for years. She turned back to me. But when Michael died, something broke in Theodore. He became obsessed with the idea that he might carry the same genetic curse. He got tested secretly, without telling our parents, and when the results came back showing he was a carrier for a different but related disorder, he made a decision that defined the rest of his life. He decided he couldn't risk passing on damaged genes to another generation. So he destroyed his chance at biological children, I said, and then destroyed his marriage by keeping it secret. He thought he was being noble, Linda said. That's the tragedy of it. Theodore genuinely believed he was protecting you and Julian from pain. He convinced himself that the lie was an act of love, and I reinforced that belief by telling him he was right to keep the secret. The door opened and I turned, expecting a nurse. Instead, Julian walked in. He looked terrible, unshaven and hollow-eyed, wearing the same clothes I'd seen him in 3 days ago. But he was there. He'd come back. Julian, I started to say, but he held up his hand. I'm not here for you, he said flatly. I'm here because I need answers, and the only person who has them is unconscious and might never wake up. So I'm going to sit here until either he wakes up and explains himself, or until he dies and I have to live the rest of my life with questions I'll never get answered. Either way, I'm done running from this. He pulled up a chair on the opposite side of Theodore's bed from where I'd been sitting and looked at his father with an expression I couldn't read. Linda and I exchanged glances. Julian, Linda said carefully, there are things I can tell you. Things your father shared with me over the years. It won't be the same as hearing it from him, but it might help. Then talk, Julian said, not looking at her. Tell me everything. I want to know why he did this, why he lied, why he let me believe he was my father while knowing the truth. So Linda told him. Everything. About Michael and the genetic disorder and Theodore's terror of passing on damaged genes. About the vasectomy and the guilt and the years of careful secrecy. About how Theodore had viewed Julian as a gift, a chance to be a father without the genetic risk. About the therapy sessions where Theodore had finally worked up the courage to reveal the truth. about the argument in the parking lot and the moment Linda pushed her brother and watched him collapse. Julian listened to all of it without interrupting, his face carved from stone. When Linda finished, there was a long silence broken only by the beeping of Theodore's monitors. "So he built our entire family on a lie because he was afraid," Julian finally said. "He was afraid of his own genetics, so he stole another man's child and pretended it was his own. And you," he looked at Linda, "you knew about it for decades and said nothing. You actively encouraged him to keep lying." "Yes," Linda admitted. "I did. And I was wrong. I'm so sorry, Julian." "Sorry doesn't fix anything," Julian said. He turned to look at me for the first time since entering the room. "And you. You had an affair and got pregnant and never bothered to verify whose child you were carrying." "I didn't know about the vasectomy," I said again, trying to keep my voice level. "I had no reason to doubt that you were Theodore's son." "Except that you'd slept with someone else," Julian shot back. "You made a choice that created this entire mess, and now you're acting like you're just another victim of Dad's lies. But you're not innocent in this, Mom. Your affair made all of this possible." The accusation stung, but I forced myself to stay calm. "You're right. I made a terrible mistake. I betrayed my marriage vows and created a situation with complex consequences. But Julian, I was 27 years old, lonely and lost, and I made one bad decision in a moment of weakness. Your father made a calculated choice to keep a massive secret for 30 years. Those aren't equivalent." "Maybe not," Julian said. "But they both destroyed my life. So from where I'm sitting, you're both to blame." He stood up and walked to Theodore's bedside, looking down at the man who'd raised him. "I spent my whole life trying to make you proud, trying to live up to the Ashford legacy. Harvard, law school, the corporate firm, even Sophia with her perfect pedigree and connections. I shaped every decision around being worthy of your name." His voice broke. "And it was all for nothing. Because I'm not an Ashford. I'm the bastard son of an affair, raised by a man who used me as a substitute for the biological children he was too afraid to have." "That's not true," I said. "Julian, your father loved you. Whatever else he did wrong, that was real." "Was it?" Julian turned to face me, and I saw tears streaming down his face for the first time. "How do I know anything about him was real? How do I trust any memory I have when the entire foundation was built on lies? When I remember him teaching me to ride a bike or helping with homework or giving me advice about college, was that love or was that guilt? Was he being my father or playing a role he'd convinced himself was noble?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't have those answers, Julian. I wish I did." "I need to talk to him," Julian said desperately, looking at Theodore's unconscious form. "I need him to wake up and explain himself. I need to hear him say why he thought this was okay, why he thought he had the right to make these choices for all of us. I need—" He broke off as one of Theodore's monitors started beeping erratically. Nurses rushed in, pushing us aside, checking vitals and making rapid assessments. One of them ran out, calling for Dr. Kensington. The neurologist arrived within minutes, examining Theodore with practiced efficiency. "His brain activity is increasing," Dr. Kensington said, studying the monitors. "This could be nothing, a temporary spike, or it could mean he's starting to emerge from the coma. We won't know for several hours. I need all of you to clear the room while we run tests." We were ushered out into the hallway. Julian, Linda, and I stood there in tense silence, waiting. After 30 minutes, Dr. Kensington came out. "He's showing more responsiveness," he said carefully. "Eye movement under the lids, slight reaction to stimuli. It's possible he could regain consciousness within the next 24 to 48 hours. But I need to warn you that even if he wakes up, there may be significant cognitive impairment from the stroke. He might not be able to communicate clearly or remember recent events. You should prepare yourselves for the possibility that even if he wakes up, he might not be able to give you the answers you're looking for." Julian's face went white. "You're saying he might wake up, but not remember why he was planning to tell us the truth? Or not be able to explain himself?" That's a possibility, yes. Brain injuries are unpredictable. We simply won't know the extent of the damage until he regains consciousness, and we can perform cognitive assessments. After the doctor left, Julian slid down the wall and sat on the floor, his head in his hands. This is unbelievable. Even now, even when he's finally about to face the consequences of his lies, he might escape having to actually explain himself. He might wake up confused and damaged, and I'll never get to ask him why. I'll never get closure. I sat down beside my son, not touching him because I could see he didn't want to be touched, but close enough that he'd know I was there. Julian, I know you're angry. At me, at your father, at Linda, at the whole situation. And you have every right to be. But whatever happens with Theodore, whatever he can or can't explain, you need to understand something. You are not defined by the lies that were told about your origins. You're defined by the choices you make going forward. Easy for you to say, Julian said bitterly. You know who you are. You know where you come from. I'm just some random product of a one-night stand, raised by a man too cowardly to tell the truth. You're my son, I said firmly. You're the boy I carried for 9 months and gave birth to and raised with every ounce of love I had in me. Biology doesn't change that. Theodore's lies don't change that. You're Julian, and you get to decide what that means. He didn't respond, just sat there staring at the opposite wall. Linda had moved down the hallway to give us space, but I could see her watching us, her face etched with guilt and regret. Mom, Julian said finally, his voice small and broken. Who was he? David. Tell me everything you remember. So I did. I told him about David's easy smile and quick laugh, about how he'd worked in medical sales and loved jazz music, about how he'd mentioned once that he'd grown up in Chicago with 2 sisters, about the few hours we'd spent together before I'd made the worst decision of my life. It wasn't much. It was pathetically little information to give a son about his biological father. But it was all I had. He's dead, Julian said. So I'll never know more than that. I'll never know if I have his smile or his talents or his weaknesses. I'll never know medical history or genetic predispositions or anything that actually matters. We can try to find his family, I offered. His sisters might still be alive. They might be willing to share information. And tell them what? Hi, your brother who died 5 years ago has a son he never knew about because my mother slept with him once at a conference and never bothered to tell him she got pregnant? That'll go over well. Julian. I'm done talking, he said, standing up abruptly. I'm going to wait here until Dad wakes up or dies, but I'm done discussing this with you. I'm done trying to make sense of lies and affairs and secrets. I just want answers from the one person who actually owes them to me. He walked back toward Theodore's room. The nurses let him sit in the corner, as long as he didn't interfere with their monitoring. I watched through the window as my son stared at his unconscious father, waiting for a reckoning that might never come. And I realized that no matter what happened when Theodore woke up, if he woke up, nothing would ever be the same. Our family had been destroyed by the revelation of secrets kept too long. Whatever emerged from this wreckage would be something entirely new, built on truth instead of lies. I just hoped we'd all survive long enough to see what that looked like. Theodore died 3 days later without ever regaining consciousness. His brain activity spiked twice more, giving us false hope each time, but he never opened his eyes or spoke or gave Julian the answers he desperately needed. In the end, his heart simply stopped at 4 a.m, while Julian was asleep in the chair beside his bed, and I was back at the hotel trying to get a few hours of rest. The nurse called me at 4:17. By the time I got to the hospital, they'd already pronounced him dead. Julian was standing at the window, staring out at the city as the sun started to rise, his face completely blank. He's gone, was all he said when I walked in. We stood there together, not touching, looking at Theodore's body in that hospital bed. The machines had been turned off, and without the rhythmic beeping, the room felt eerily silent. My husband of 32 years looked peaceful, like he was just sleeping, like he might wake up any moment and explain everything. But he never would. The secrets he'd carried for 3 decades had died with him, leaving us with fragments and second-hand accounts and more questions than answers. The funeral was small. I didn't want a big production, and Julian agreed. Just close colleagues from Theodore's hospital, a few of my business associates, Linda and her family, Rebecca. Sophia didn't come. She'd already moved on, accepted a job offer in San Francisco, putting 3,000 miles between herself and the wreckage of her broken engagement. Julian delivered the eulogy. He stood at the podium in his dark suit, looking older than his 29 years, and talked about the father he'd thought he'd known, the man who'd taught him to throw a baseball and helped him with calculus and driven him to Harvard on move-in day. He didn't mention the vasectomy or the lies or the biological truth that had destroyed everything. He just talked about memories and let people interpret them however they wanted. I watched my son speak and realized he was doing what I'd advised. He was choosing what to make of his identity going forward. He was acknowledging the love that had existed alongside the deception, accepting the complexity rather than demanding simple answers to impossible questions. After the service, Linda approached me hesitantly. "I'm going back to Boston tomorrow. But before I go, I wanted you to know that I'm making arrangements to cover the costs of any genetic testing Julian wants to do. It's the least I can do after keeping Theodore's secret for so long." "That's generous," I said, "but Julian is financially stable. He can afford his own medical testing." "Please," Linda said, "let me do this. I need to do something to help fix what I helped break." I nodded, too tired to argue. Linda had been carrying her own guilt since Theodore's collapse, and if this gave her some sense of redemption, I wouldn't take that from her. The weeks after the funeral blurred together. I sold the house in Greenwich. Couldn't bear to live there anymore, surrounded by memories of a marriage built on lies. I bought a smaller place in Manhattan, closer to my office, and threw myself back into work with the same intensity I'd used to build my company 30 years ago. Julian went back to his job, but took a leave of absence 2 months later. He told me he needed time to figure out who he was without the identity he'd built around being Theodore Ashford's son. He traveled for a while, sending occasional texts from Thailand and Peru and Iceland. Brief updates that let me know he was alive, but nothing that suggested he'd forgiven me. Rebecca helped me track down David's family. It took her investigator 3 months, but he eventually found one of David's sisters living in Denver. Her name was Patricia, and she was 54 years old, married with 3 children of her own. I called her on a Tuesday evening, my hands shaking as I dialed. "This is going to sound insane," I started, "but I knew your brother David briefly in 1995. I need to tell you something about him that he never knew himself." There was a long pause. Then Patricia said, "Is this about the baby? Because David's other sister mentioned years ago that she'd heard a rumor he might have gotten someone pregnant at a conference, but we never knew if it was true." I was so shocked I almost dropped the phone. "You knew?" "We suspected," Patricia corrected. David came back from that Boston conference acting strange, guilty about something. He mentioned meeting a woman, but said it was a mistake and he'd never see her again. Then a few months later, someone who knew someone from the medical device company told my sister that there was a woman asking questions about David, that she might be pregnant. But we never heard anything more, so we figured it was just gossip. "It wasn't gossip," I said. "I have a son, David's son. He's 29 years old, and he just found out that the man who raised him wasn't his biological father. He'd like to know more about David's medical history, if you're willing to share it." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "I'd like to meet him, if he's open to that. David was a good man, despite his mistakes. He died never knowing he had a son. I think he would have wanted to know." I gave her Julian's contact information, leaving it up to him whether to reach out. He did, 3 weeks later. He flew to Denver and spent a weekend with David's family, learning about the man whose genes he carried. When he came back, he seemed different. Not healed exactly, but less broken. Like he'd found some piece of himself he didn't know was missing. "They're good people," he told me over coffee at a cafe near my new apartment. It was the first real conversation we'd had in months. David's family. They welcomed me without judgment. His sister Patricia looks a little like me around the eyes. And they told me stories about him, about how he was funny and kind and died trying to help someone change a tire on the highway. "I'm glad you met them," I said carefully. "Mom, I need to tell you something." Julian set down his coffee and looked at me directly for the first time since I'd revealed the truth about his paternity. "I've been angry at you for months. Furious, actually. I blamed you for the affair, for not knowing Dad wasn't my biological father, for destroying the perfect life I thought I had." "I know," I said quietly. "But Patricia said something that changed my perspective. She said that David made a mistake that night with you, but that doesn't mean I'm a mistake. She said every person is the sum of countless choices made by countless people, and that being angry about the circumstances of my birth is like being angry at the universe for existing. It doesn't change anything. It just makes you bitter." I felt tears starting but blinked them back. She sounds wise. She is. And she's right. I can't change how I was conceived or who my biological father was or the fact that Dad lied for my entire life. But I can choose what to do with the truth now that I have it. He reached across the table and took my hand. "I choose to forgive you, Mom. You made a mistake when you were young and lonely. Dad made a bigger mistake by keeping secrets, but you told me the truth when you found out, even though you knew it would hurt me. That took courage. I did cry then, unable to hold back anymore. I'm so sorry, Julian, for all of it. For the affair, for the pain this has caused you, for the identity crisis." "Stop," he said gently. "I don't need more apologies. I need us to move forward. I need to rebuild my relationship with you based on honesty instead of secrets. Can we do that?" "Yes," I said. "I'd like that very much." We finished our coffee and walked through the city together, talking about everything and nothing. About his plans to maybe switch practice areas, focus on something that mattered more than corporate mergers. About my company and whether I was ready to think about succession planning. About the fact that he'd been on a few dates with someone he met in Peru, nothing serious yet but promising. We didn't talk about Theodore. That wound was still too fresh, too complicated. Maybe someday we'd be able to discuss the man who'd raised Julian with love and deception in equal measure. But not yet. 6 months after Theodore's death, I received a package from Linda. Inside were letters, hundreds of them apparently. Letters Theodore had written to Julian over the years, but never sent. Letters expressing love and pride and fear and guilt. The last one, dated 2 days before his collapse, was addressed to both of us. I read it alone first, sitting in my apartment with a glass of wine I didn't drink. Theodore's handwriting was familiar, the same elegant script he'd used to write grocery lists and birthday cards for 3 decades. "Vivian and Julian," it began, "by the time you read this, you'll know the truth about the vasectomy and Julian's paternity. I hope you heard it from me in a controlled setting with professional support, but if you're reading this letter, something went wrong with my plan. Either I lost my nerve, or something happened to prevent me from telling you myself. Either way, you deserve to know why I made the choices I made, even if those choices were wrong." He went on to explain everything Linda had already told us. The genetic fears, the vasectomy, the relief when I'd confessed the affair, because it gave him a way to be a father without the genetic risk. But then, he wrote something neither Linda nor anyone else had known. "Julian, I fell in love with you the moment the nurse put you in my arms. I looked at your tiny face and I knew you weren't biologically mine, but it didn't matter. You were mine in every way that counted. And every day for the next 29 years, I had to choose between telling you the truth and losing the right to be your father, or keeping the secret and staying in your life. I chose wrong. I chose selfishly. I chose my own fear over your right to know your own story, and I'm sorrier than words can express. He ended the letter with a request. Please don't let my lies poison the love that was real. I loved you both, however imperfectly. I hope someday you can forgive me for being too weak to tell the truth while I was alive to face the consequences. I gave the letter to Julian the next day. He read it in my living room, tears streaming down his face, and when he finished, he looked at me and said, "He was right about one thing. The love was real. It was complicated and messy and built on lies, but it was real." Yes, I agreed. It was. We sat together in silence, holding Theodore's final words, mourning the father who'd loved Julian enough to raise him, but not enough to be honest with him. It wasn't the resolution either of us had hoped for, but it was the one we had. And somehow, we'd find a way to build our lives on that truth. Together, finally honest with each other, we'd figure out what came next. Because that's what you do when secrets destroy everything you thought you knew. You pick up the pieces that matter, and you start again.